My name is Ike Miller. I live here in North Carolina in the United States. I am married. I have three kids, two boys and a girl. They are 11, 9, and 6. My wife and I are both pastors, and that's what we do is lead a church here. But we also love to write and travel and speak. And yes, that's a little bit of our story.
Beautiful. Beautiful story. I gather that you had some alcoholism in your own family, Ike, and I wondered how that impacted you as a child when you were growing up. Was there evidence of this over drinking going on?
Yeah, so to share a little bit of my backstory, my father struggled with alcoholism, and it wasn't a secret to us. It was something that we had lots of conversations about with my mom anyway, and she would share about this is why this is happening. This is an issue. My father wasn't the type that was drink till he blacked out kind of drunk. It was more of a high functioning alcoholism, but it led to lots of chaos in our family of origin. Obviously, lots of arguments between my mom and my dad. Where it really started to become an issue is when my dad would drive with us in the car. And obviously, that's terrifying for my mother. My dad also struggled with some controlling tendencies and controlling my mom, controlling where she went, what she did, had some very strong views on what she should do, what she shouldn't be doing. And so eventually they separated, and then my father developed prostate cancer. My mom saw this as a second chance, thought, okay, after going through cancer, surely this will change his drinking habits. So they got back together and things seemed to be better for a little while. But eventually my dad went back to drinking, and ultimately when it became clear he was drinking with us in the car again, it was like, that's got to be the end. We can't do this anymore. So after that, they officially divorced. In terms of the impact on me personally, I don't think I was really honest with myself until probably the last few years that my father could be abusive. When I began to share things like my dad would kick me while I was on the floor, that kind of thing, like that's abuse. And
Of
being
course
able to
it
name
is.
that out loud obviously was really helpful and healing to begin to do some of that work.
And what age were you when they finally separated?
Yeah, so they separated when I was a freshman in high school, so I would have been about 14, and then they divorced when I was 18.
Okay. So talk to us about your own drinking story.
Yeah, so because of my family and what we had seen there and growing up in a more religious context, between the way that alcohol was talked about in that context as well as what I'd seen it do to my family, alcohol in my mind was just evil. And it was something that you did not play with. And so I did not drink anything until I was 22. I think I was
Mm.
22 when I took my first drink. What made it so appealing at that point was when I drank for the first time, all of a sudden, all of my overly self-conscious thoughts and feelings, all of the things that made me feel like I had to present the best version of myself all the time, all of that just was turned off. And it was
It
so freeing and
Yeah,
so liberating. Oh man, it feels so good just to not think about those things.
yeah. It's like a
And
magic potion, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely. So that created this craving of, I want to feel that again, that feeling of just being able to silence all of those thoughts and just be me. And so that was when I was 22. And then actually in the fall of that year, my father passed away. He passed away due to cirrhosis of the liver, complications due to alcoholism. I think it was a mix of his continued alcoholism, but I think he was also self medicating for some pain that was exacerbating his drinking. So that obviously threw a whole different level of grief and pain into things as I was processing how I felt about all of that. And so I think that contributed to me just drinking more
Yeah.
and throwing myself more into that. When I started dating my wife, I started to wrestle internally with the questions of, okay, am I going to go down the same path that my dad went down? Is this going to go to the same place? Obviously, when you're under the influence of alcohol, you make less wise decisions, and having some of those conversations with my wife and realizing like I could really hurt our relationship by making an unwise choice under the influence of alcohol. So we created some sort of boundaries around how much I would drink, when I would drink, some of those kinds of things. And
Was she a drinker, Ike?
she was not, no. So
Mm.
she's never drank much. She would drink casually, but she never experienced any of that kind of freedom that I felt when I drank. There wasn't that kind of euphoria. And to make matters worse, her father was the child of two alcoholics.
Oh, yeah.
So he had his own trauma from that he had worked through. And she has lost now several uncles due to their alcoholism. And so I think for her, there was a real sober mindset when it came to alcohol.
Yeah.
She wasn't strongly against it, but also was aware of the dangers of it. And we created some boundaries around it. It wasn't hard for me to live by those boundaries. I felt like I had good accountability and our marriage was in a good place. I didn't need to escape that. However, in 2009, I began to experience some of my own struggle with depression. And during that season, experienced my first diagnosis with depression. That was not necessarily connected to my drinking at that time. I wasn't consuming a lot, but I was on a medication that then I went off of, and then a couple of years later was re-diagnosed with depression. One of the interesting things that happens was the medication that I was on, if I drank anything, I would have a headache. I would feel terrible. So it was actually this powerful accountability. Fast forward to 2020, and obviously worldwide pandemic. We're all living in the midst of that. Kids are home all the time. We're figuring out homeschooling. Our kids are 2, 5, and 7 at that point. We're just locked up at home, and it is stressful. It is overwhelming. I start experiencing some recurrence of my depression. I'm also experiencing a lot of anxiety around leading our organization and all of the turmoil at the time, whether that was things around the pandemic or in America, the racial unrest and tension and how to navigate those kinds of things. So I was dealing with a lot of anxiety. And so I started taking an anxiety medication, Klonopin. And what was really interesting was when I started taking Klonopin, it actually countered the effects of my medication such that I could drink more without getting sick, without having a headache, without feeling if I have one drink, I'm going to feel terrible. What that meant was taking the Klonopin allowed me to drink. And then obviously Klonopin exacerbates the effects of alcohol. So this is really where my story started to hit a climax when it came to alcohol. Was I was using an anxiety medication to counter the effects of my depression medication so that I could drink and enjoy drinking.
Complicated cocktail there.
Yes, exactly. So where this gets really tricky with my family was I knew that there was this part of me that had an addictive side. And so when it came to me taking this Klonopin, I knew that there was a chance that I might misuse it. So I actually gave the Klonopin to my wife to manage. What I didn't anticipate was by giving her that medication, now whenever I needed it, it meant we had to have a whole conversation that I had to explain how I was feeling and realized that was much more difficult than I expected.
Yeah.
When my medication came due for a refill, I refilled it, but I did not tell her that I had refilled it. And now I had the freedom to take it as I wanted to. This went on for a while where I was hiding this. She didn't know that, but that was allowing me to drink. She had actually started drinking a little bit more just because we're in the pandemic and alcoholism seemed to rise during that season. So there was a more lax mentality towards it in our household in general. But it all came to a head when she discovered that I was still taking Klonopin and that I was using it essentially to be able to drink. That created lots of painful feelings, obviously, some feelings of deception and deceit. And that led to, obviously, some more intentional conversations with our counselor.
So did you actually have a rock bottom? Was it this row about you taking the medication without her knowing?
What happened is she discovered that I had this medication that she didn't know about, threw her into a tailspin. And I wasn't thinking clearly. For the first time, Sharon, my wife, did not feel safe with me. That was a real hard thing for me to accept because here I am realizing I am starting to go down the path that my father went down. So starting to feel some of that, but at the same time, I didn't know what else to do. And I think when you begin to use substances to cope with life, there's
Mm,
this tension of, on the one hand, you don't want to live life this way, and yet you don't know how else to live life.
mm,
What am I going to use to cope when this gets
mm,
hard
mm.
again? So I was in this place of turmoil. That led to some hard conversations with my wife, where on the one hand, yes, I wanted to let go of it. On the other hand, I didn't know how to cope without it. I was blaming her for things that kind of justified me using this in some way. If I don't have this medication anymore, what am I going to do? I had a conversation with my psychiatrist about this, but I probably wasn't fully transparent. And so I had him prescribe a different anxiety medication. It was one that I could still use for this, but it wasn't the same one.
Perhaps you couldn't drink and get a good result on that one. Right.
That's right.
Okay.
My wife was on high alert about things. And so there was just like lots of pain around feeling deceived and my dishonesty. And did she really know me? I think this was a very different side of me than she'd ever experienced before.
How long had you been married by that point?
12 years at that point.
That's a long time. So
Yeah,
you think
yeah.
you know somebody, don't you? And so it's quite
That's
hurtful
exactly
when.
right. Yeah. And so, have I ever known you? Have you
Mm,
always been pretending? It wasn't a rock bottom in the sense that I lost my family, I lost my kids, but it was a rock bottom in the sense that I realized for everything in me that did not want to be my father, I was becoming my father.
yeah. Yeah.
Really, the moment that I had to really confront this was in meeting with our counselor. Uh, because of what I had seen in my parents' marriage, we decided to start seeing a counselor our first year of marriage. Not as we've got big problems, but more, how do we prevent big problems? You know, you take your car in to get the oil changed because you don't want it to die on the side of the road. And that's
Totally.
the way we approached it. So we were talking with our counselor about this, and she said something in the middle of this because I had talked about the hiding of the medication and stuff. And she said to me, "This feels like addictive behavior." And my immediate reaction to that was, "Oh, no, I've got this under control. This is totally fine. I could stop if I wanted to. It is not that big of a deal." That was my initial thought. But then the next thought, and this is the thought that genuinely saved my life, saved my marriage, saved my relationship with my kids. I had the realization in this moment, who is thinking more clearly about this, me or my counselor?
Mhm.
Obviously, anyone in their right mind would say, my counselor is obviously thinking more clearly about this than me.
Yeah.
Then it became a question of, okay, wisdom would say I should listen to my counselor in this moment and acknowledge that if I continue down this road, this is going to lead to a place that I don't want to go. And so that was a pivotal moment for me in all of this.
Yeah. Good for you for listening.
You know,
Because as you say, you weren't on your uppers, you hadn't started losing stuff, so you could have
yeah,
carried on for years.
that's
But
exactly
just
right.
this thought, this spectre of your father, sometimes it's good to have that in your background because it helps to stop you going too far, doesn't it?
One of the things that I had said for a long time, and was a real point of pain for me as a child, was the feeling that my father had chosen alcohol over a relationship with me. Now understanding addiction more, I understand it's much more complicated than that. But as a
Yeah.
child, that's what it feels like.
And
And
you never wanted your children to feel that way. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And so in that moment, realizing I'm at that point of making that
Yeah.
choice in
Yeah.
terms
Well,
of how
good for
my
you.
children would experience it.
Good for
And
you.
so,
And was it difficult? How, was it difficult to quit? And how did you do it? Did you get help?
yeah. So I started meeting with an addiction counselor at that time. I was also really beginning to dig into the impact of having an alcoholic parent and the ways that had shaped me. So I started attending a adult children of alcoholics
Mm.
meeting, the kind of 12 steps for children
Yeah.
who grew up with an alcoholic parent. And so that was really helpful to begin to understand and piece some of that together. Started reading a lot about the codependency that I had developed with an alcoholic parent and how that had shaped me and my relationships, and this feeling I had to always present the best version of myself to everyone and to be whoever the people around me wanted me to be so that they would be happy with me and so that I would be safe. And realizing that all of that was contributing to this feeling of overwhelm that I was using this medication and alcohol to try to cope with.
Yeah.
So that was really where I started my healing process, was starting to understand, okay, what about my life is unmanageable? Why do I need something else to help me cope with my life? How do I change my life so that it's not something I have to find or I have to use alcohol or substances to cope with? That meant a lot of internal work of naming, why do I feel overwhelmed? I find my identity in my performance. I find my value in my performance, in my achievement.
Yeah.
And so if I can pull back from that, then will experience less overwhelm. If
Yeah.
I experience less overwhelm, then I won't have to run to these substances as
Yeah.
much.
I
And
mean,
so
it's exhausting trying to be perfect all the
it
time.
is. You're
We're
exactly
not
right.
perfect.
We are not. So it was really realizing, okay, this isn't just a matter of removing alcohol from my life. This means re-examining my whole life so that
Yeah.
alcohol is not necessary.
Those of us that have got into this fix, we do re-examine our life, don't we? In a way
Yes,
that we never would have done if we hadn't have developed this little problem.
that's exactly right. It
Yeah.
forces us to face some pain that
Yeah.
maybe we wouldn't have if we hadn't come face to face with rock bottom or
Yeah.
relational brokenness that was coming because of our actions. And so you're exactly right. It forces some self-examination if we're willing to do it.
Yeah. There's even a book by a woman called Laura McCowan, and it's called We Are the Luckiest. And that's her theme, that
Oh,
those of us that
wow.
have been forced to the wall because of this issue, we're the luckiest. I really like that take on addiction. How did you get through those difficult few months? Any tips for people listening? Any
Yeah,
tricks you
I
learned?
think I think a couple of things were helpful. I think with my wife, I had to start having some really honest conversations. So, for example, as I was processing the impact of my own childhood, I had to get really honest about the fact that a part of what was driving me to alcoholism was in the pandemic when I was with my kids and I had them by myself, my wife was working, and I was feeling overwhelmed. To ask for help felt like a failure. It felt like I was failing as a father. It felt like
Because,
I
of
was.
course, you had to be the perfect father.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So rather than asking for help, it was easier for me to just drink and numb those feelings and cope with it in that way. And so getting really honest to be able to say, I'm afraid that I am a bad father. And being able to say that out loud and hear my wife say back to me, that's not true. You're not a bad father. But that's a hard thing to say out loud. But
Yeah,
being
yeah.
able to say those things out loud allowed for healing for me, allowed for intimacy in our relationship. I think she began to feel like she knew me in a way that she didn't know me before. So there was some powerful kind of things happening in our relationship because of this. But it required pulling my chest open and saying, here's who I
Absolutely,
am.
because you wouldn't have had that reassurance from your wife that you're a good father if you hadn't have been
That's
honest
ex-
about how you were feeling. And then
That's
that
exactly
helps
right.
to heal you when you realize that's her perception.
Yeah. So that was a big thing. Obviously, having an addiction counselor that I was meeting with monthly was really helpful. Going to the Adult Children of Alcoholics was really helpful as well. Part of my addiction counseling was the counselor. He said a major part of why children of alcoholics fall into alcoholism themselves is because there is this sort of shame that operates in the subconscious that we're trying to silence. What that did was it led me to then say, okay, how do I deal with those feelings of shame and those thoughts in healthy ways? And to begin to process what are those feelings. So, meeting with my personal counselor that my wife and I met with, that was really helpful. So, those were some of the key things for me in my journey.
Okay. And how long was it before you started feeling okay and you could drop the counseling sessions or maybe reduce them a little bit?
I think I met with my counselor monthly for a year.
Hmm.
And then we slowly started to reduce.
So you've got about 3 or 4 years sobriety
That's
now?
right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. 3 years.
Congratulations. Well done.
Thank you. Thank
Talk to
you.
us about the benefits.
Yeah. One of the changes that happened in me was going from being the child of an alcoholic and experiencing alcoholism from that side to beginning to understand the experience of an alcoholic myself and alcoholism myself. As someone who does, as a pastor, a lot of counseling and working with people through this kind of stuff, it helped me to understand both the experience of someone who has had an alcoholic parent as well as the struggle with substance use myself. To be able to say that for anyone that's struggling with substance use, you're not struggling with that because you're thriving. You're not living your best life. You are in pain, right? And
Yeah.
for a lot of us that are struggling with substance use of some sort, we are at the heart of it, we're trying to deal with pain. So being able to enter into those conversations from a place of compassion and understanding versus another voice that heaps shame
Mm.
has been personally just a very helpful thing in this process. Yeah,
Yeah. And I'm sure it's made you a much better counselor because
that's
if you
right.
are helping someone with alcoholism or child of an alcoholic parent, you can say, I've been there.
Yeah, that's exactly
Yeah.
right. Mm.
Yeah. So talk to me about your book. Why did you decide to write this book and who is it for?
Yeah. So I wrote this book because as I was going through my own journey of understanding the impact of my childhood on me, on my marriage, on my leadership, on my career, on how I interacted with my employees, I was initially dealing with all of what we would call baggage of
Yeah.
my childhood and the ways that it was hurting my relationships. And in particular, things like codependency, where I just felt like I need to fix everybody's problems around me. I was reading Melody Beattie's book, Codependency No More. And in there, she talks about how a major symptom of codependency is the feeling of needing to manage the feelings and reactions of everyone around you with your own words and actions. That stopped me dead in my tracks because that is me. I'm trying to manage everyone's feelings around me.
Mm. Yeah, you're trying
And
to fix everyone, and as a counselor, you know that it's only them that can fix themselves, and you can
yes,
facilitate that maybe, but we can't fix everyone.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And especially in a season where everybody is already anxious. So for me to feel like I need to fix everybody's feelings, it's impossible, but it's also emotionally exhausting for me.
Yes.
So I was working through the negative impacts of my childhood, but I also began to realize that there were things that my childhood actually put in me that I could use for the good of my relationships if I could learn how. So, for
Yeah.
example, one of the easiest examples is growing up with a parent with alcoholism. You go into every room wondering, okay, Is it safe to be here? What kind of emotional state is my parent in? Are they angry? Are they happy? Are they sad? Is it safe to be here? Do I need to find a way out? And so you learn to read emotions, you learn to read body language. So as an adult now, I walked into every room kind of reading the emotional climate of the room. How's everybody feeling? Anybody upset? Anybody sad? Anybody angry? And immediately jumping to fixing that, right? Which is exhausting. But I realized if I can step back from this need to fix it, that can actually be a real helpful tool for
Absolutely.
demonstrating empathy for others.
It's emotional intelligence.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I began to realize, you know what? I think there's actually some things that our childhoods put in us that if we can learn to leverage them, they can actually help us to have healthier relationships. That's how I came up with the title Good Baggage. We typically think of baggage as all the bad things or all the things that make us bad at relationships, but realizing actually there's some stuff that's packed in our bags that we can actually use for the good of our relationships if we can learn how to use it.
That's a brilliant reframe. We like reframes at Tribe Sober. We're always saying to
That's
people,
good.
you don't have a drinking problem. You've got an opportunity to change your
There
life.
you go. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I love
absolutely.
this good baggage thing. How can people find out more about you and your book?
The easiest way to find out more is my website, ikemiller.com. I've also got on there a link to a mini series of podcast conversations that I did around good baggage with mental health professionals and counselors and people sharing their own stories.
Can they buy your book on the website?
They can. Yeah, they can buy the book on the website. It has links to Amazon, Target, wherever books are sold, you can get it online. Yeah,
Brilliant.
absolutely. One of the things that I wanted was for people to read it and people to say, it's not just me. And to be able to identify with that experience and
Yeah.
say, oh, I thought I was the only one, or this
Yeah.
explains so much, or
Yeah.
I'm not destined to have bad relationships because of my
Yeah.
parents'
Yeah.
relationship. And to just experience that freedom. One of the things that I really want for people to be able to say, we may not have known what a healthy relationship looked like, but we knew what kind of relationship we didn't want, right?
Yes. Yes. Nice one. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that gives us a passion to pursue healthy relationships for ourselves.
In my experience of children of alcoholics that I've interviewed, they either follow in the footsteps and they're very fatalistic and they think, oh, it's in my genes, I've got no choice,
Yes.
or they avoid it. I say to people, even if they come from a family with alcoholism, maybe genetics is the gun, but we've got our finger on the trigger and
That's great.
lifestyle is the trigger. We
That's right.
can go a different way, and that's exactly what you've done. Another great thing about your book, I think, is that it'll start a dialogue, and I'm sure it already has.
Mhm.
People say, oh, I've been reading this book, and it says, and they'll go, oh, yeah. And that helps people to drop the shame, doesn't it? Because
Yes, it
it's out
does.
there. They
It
realize
does.
there's another
Yeah.
way.
Shame is such a powerful thing.
Mhm.
And the more ways that we can help people find freedom from it,
Yeah.
the better. Yeah.
Did you find it cathartic writing this book?
I absolutely did.
Yeah.
I share a lot of very vulnerable stories in there, and that's been a lot of people's responses. I just can't believe how honest and vulnerable you were. Quite honestly, one of the things that I realized as I shared my story, it's so helpful for people to hear that, but it's also really helpful for me to process these
Yeah. Yeah.
experiences and
Yeah.
to examine them and to understand them and to understand how they affect my relationships. And so it's very cathartic to work through these things and to share these
Yeah,
stories.
that makes me think of workshops that I've run. I ask people to share their story. You can see when they're talking about their story that sometimes it's the first time they've ever expressed out loud to other people just how unhappy this is all making them.
Yeah.
And yeah, they get very emotional, but you can see that there's a healing taking place and that the shame is almost dissolving. And then you see the
Yes.
other people watching that. and going, "Oh, it's not just me then." And then you see
Yeah.
someone get up and hug them, and it's just so powerful.
That
And
it
it's the power of vulnerability, isn't it?
that's exactly right.
Because society has made us all wear this mask all the time,
Mhm.
like you and your perfection, and it's exhausting.
Yes, it
And just to
is.
take off that mask, and that's why I love the recovery community, because
Mhm.
there's no bullshit, is there?
No,
We're
not
honest
at all.
with each other. The conversations are so different to the kind of parties I used to go when I was younger, when everybody was showing off about their new job or their latest car or how much money they
Yeah.
had. But this is real
Yes.
communication.
You feel like I actually am connecting with other people,
Yeah,
not just showing up and showing off my mask and pretending, but
yeah,
nobody really
yeah,
knows me. It
exactly.
it's it is such a beautiful thing to just
Yeah,
come and say,
yeah,
"Look, let's put aside the pretense. Let's just
yeah,
recognize we are all human,
yeah.
and being human is hard."
Yeah, it
Um,
is, and we're all doing our best out here,
that's
and
right.
if we can help each other, then yeah,
Yes.
connection's the opposite of addiction.
That's right.
Simple
You're
as that.
exactly right.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
because when we are addicted, we're isolated and we're wearing a mask,
Yeah.
pretending everything's fine. The functioning alcoholic has an
Yep.
exhausting life trying to keep the show on the road and pretending everything's fine and feeling
Yeah.
empty and broken inside.
And then knowing if I share this, then everybody's gonna know I was a phony, and it just makes it harder and harder to
Mm,
share. But when we can find a safe place to take the
yeah.
mask off for the first time and experience, it's so good to be able to just take that off. It's
Yeah,
beautiful.
that's what I say to people. Find your people and be real with them. What about if someone's listening to this and they're trapped in their drinking and they know it's not good, but they just
Mhm.
don't know how to make that change? Because I think that's the most difficult thing, isn't it? Just
Yeah.
to get started. So, what would you
Yeah.
say to them?
My encouragement would be to begin to understand that your life can either get better from this point or it can get worse. It's going to be hard. An addiction is a incredibly difficult thing to break, but each moment is a time to think, okay, am I going to take a step towards a better life, towards better relationships, towards greater physical and mental health? Or am I going to continue down a path that's going to lead to greater brokenness for myself and for those around me? Because it's not going to stay neutral. I mean, seeing it go to the point of my father dying due to the consuming of alcohol, it doesn't stay neutral. It just gets worse and it expands. And so being able to begin with that mindset of however hard it is, no matter what it takes, how do I take a step today towards a better life, better relationships versus worse and more brokenness?
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I say to people, it's hard doing this, but maybe it's hard for 3 months, maybe six, and then it
Yes.
gets easier and easier. Carry
Mhm.
on drinking, and it gets harder and harder.
It
Yeah.
does. I think the first time that somebody really acknowledges that this is a struggle, I think feels so intimidating. But it's also a huge moment for the first time of like potentially a glimpse of light.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. I think in
and
our first few months of quitting, we
Mhm.
do get these glimmers of light, don't we?
Yeah,
I remember
we
I
do.
used to think, oh, this is so hard. And then I'd have a day that was beautiful. And I think, oh, maybe it's all right.
Yeah,
I
maybe
just
there could
keep
be more
going.
of these.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else you think we should mention before we say goodbye?
I think one of the interesting things was I think my wife wanted me to be ready to share this with everyone, like day 5. Like, the more
Mm,
people that know, the better, the more, and I think for her, that felt like that would help me heal. But in reality, what that did was that created a greater impulse to want to hide because it
mm,
felt very shameful and it felt very embarrassing. I think what she was going off of is people in our lives who had been sober for 20, 30 years who talked very openly and freely about it. And so, for anyone that's listening, especially for anyone that's maybe a spouse of someone that's struggling with this, to know that maybe they're struggling right now and it's hard for them to think about sharing it with people, but that's not always going to be the case.
No.
And so giving them the ability to disclose that with who they need to in the right time so that it doesn't create this animosity between you as a couple and it doesn't exacerbate this need to cope and to hide. That was just one of those lessons that was helpful for us to learn, and I think is helpful for other couples to know as they walk
Yeah,
through this
that's a
together.
very good point. I hadn't thought about that. We feel raw and vulnerable in early sobriety, and I think we
Yeah.
have to share when we're ready with the wider population. You
Yeah.
don't feel like telling people at parties that you're on day 5, do
No,
you?
and that was one of the great things was we met once with or a couple times with my addiction counselor together, and they said, "There's a reason it's called Alcoholics Anonymous." Like
Yeah, but we feel stronger and stronger
that's right.
until we want to tell everybody because we
That's
want
right.
them to come to this place. Sober
Yeah.
land, I call it.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I love that. I love that.